So to me, the minute that I finished Overwhelmed, I knew that so much of the source of what was driving overwhelm for women, for men, really for anybody, was work and the way we work. And so I wanted to do that same deep dive. I wanted to understand. I wanted to go on that same journey of understanding why are things the way they are and looking really solidly at where are they better? How could they be better? What could we learn? And that has resulted in another journey book, which I called Overwork, Transforming the Daily Grind in the Quest for a Better Life. We were initially going to call it Overworked, and really look at particularly the cost and consequences of sort of the always on culture, the hustle culture, the long hours, the worrying about work after hours, the late night emails, ruminating, service workers who were like called in at any minute. So you're sort of perpetually on call, sort of like really trying to look at that. And I sold the proposal, Overworked, in March of 2020. Well, guess what happened? The entire world shut down. I was ready to sit down and write that book in March of 2020. Again, worked with the same wonderful editor publisher, Sarah Crichton. She had been at Farrar Straus Giroux for the first book. She had moved to Holt for the second book. And she called me up in April. She's like, Brigid, we can't call this book Overworked anymore because you've got millions of people unemployed. And I said, Sarah, we can't write this book right now anyway. We can't write this book right now because if this lasts 6 weeks, then all my reporting stands and I can write it. But if it lasts longer and things change, we got to be on top of it. I got to be reporting. She's like, okay. And she extended the deadline. And instead of sitting down to write, I brought my, I've always got one with me, brought my reporter notebook back out. And I went back out and I kept reporting. And reporting and reporting and reporting. And throughout the pandemic, and then our lives changed and Sarah ended up moving on. And I worked with a second editor who was just wonderful at Holt, Reva Hockerman. She was fantastic. Again, really understood what I was trying to do, which was really asking that big question. Why do we work this way? What's the benefit? Who benefits from it? And is there a different way to do it? And would it be better? So the book asks a really simple question, and the answer is yes. But well, actually, let me rephrase it. The answer is no. We don't have to work like this, and yes, there's a better way, and yes, we all benefit when we work differently. Everybody benefits, at work and love and play. And so that was really a fascinating journey to go on because I started. It's the reason I left the Washington Post. I had an editor at the Post when I was working on Overwhelmed. He said, you're going to have so many more stories that you can't get into that book. I want you to come back and make that into a beat. And so I thought, awesome, that's great. And then whatever that beat is, I'll keep asking the questions and keep reporting. And then that will lead to this next book because I really want to dive into work culture. And I'd already told him that. He's like, yeah, let's do it. Then I came back to the Post after book leave and he left. And there was a new editor and they didn't want that anymore. And they didn't want that from me. And they said, yeah, go cover poverty. I'm like, I'm fine. I've been covering poverty for 25 years. But I've become an expert on this other thing. How about if I do both? Because to me, it's sort of the same thing. It's just it's all about how we combine work and care in our lives. Sometimes you have money, sometimes you don't. So it was very difficult trying to do kind of two beats at once. And I remember at the Post, I was looking and I was writing about the short work hours movement. I was writing about kind of creative ways that people were trying to change work. And I got so much pushback. I had the Sunday page one editor come to me once and he looked harried, because everybody overworks and everybody brags about, oh, I worked late. I spent the night at the office. It's a real overwork culture in newspapers. And he came to me and he looked haggard. And he just goes, Brigid, you have to stop writing these stories, because it was depressing to him. Because it's like he wasn't working that way. So it was also threatening. Like, how can you work at a high level and have time for lunch and then take Fridays off? I don't get it. And it was threatening. And there was another time I wrote another story about digital remote network work before it became a thing that everybody started to do, if you could, during the pandemic. And I had another editor, again, got some real pushback. And she said, this reads like advocacy. You need the other side. And I said, the other side to like working reasonably? like, you want me to talk to somebody who thinks we shouldn't work this way? So it was really weird. Like, they didn't know what to do with the stuff that I was writing at the Post. And they also really didn't understand how to write about work, family, gender, care. I put together a big 2-page memo and I said, this is what we need to do to cover these issues. These are economic issues. These are human rights issues. These are about quality of life. These are how we live now. We need to write about work, family, gender, and care locally, nationally, internationally. We need to look at policies. We need to look at, what are workplaces that are doing? What are our cultural attitudes? And I remember having a meeting with the top editors, and they're like, yeah, no, we're not going to do this. Why don't you go write another mommy war story? Like, oh my God, And so I'd had my fellowship at the think tank New America working on the first book. And I was having coffee with Anne-Marie Slaughter, who had just come on as the new CEO and president. And she said, well, Brigid, we'd love to have you back. And I said, well, this is what I wanted to do. And I handed her the very same 2-page memo that I handed the Post editors. And she's like, I love it. Let's do it. So that's what I'm doing. I am doing at New America what I proposed doing at the Washington Post, and they weren't interested. It took me 10 years to report this book, to get to the point where I felt like I had enough and I knew what I wanted to say. And I learned a lot along the way. And then the pandemic hit. Yeah. And then I had to completely change gears in the midstream. I work too much. I do. I'm passionate about what I do. I'm sure it's probably driven by never feeling like I do enough or it's good enough. That's part of it. Also, I'm just really curious and, I want to know more. So I struggle with overwork. And that's the very first line. I mean, I get it. I'm not an anti-work person. There's a lot of people who are. There's an anti-work Reddit. I'm not. And I think that work plays a really important role in our lives, not only for earning our living, but giving us a sense of purpose and, meaning, or it can for many people. For a lot of people, it's a job. But even the job gives you a sense of purpose and identity and meaning. But where it goes wrong is when it becomes your only purpose and identity and meaning. And I think that we've done ourselves a disservice with all of the discussion about passion and follow your passion, because that becomes then a key to kind of constantly driving and staying in that work sphere, not developing other parts of your life, and also makes you really rife for being exploited. Because an employer I even had somebody, an editor once came to me and just said, we love reporters like you. You're so paranoid, you'll do anything we say. They bank on you feeling like not enough, and so that you'll keep working and working and working. My husband used to say that the Washington Post was my favorite charity because I put in an awful lot of time that you're not paid for. So what we don't realize is that when we work that way, we're gifting our lives back to an employer. And, as Sarah Jabby so brilliantly said, work doesn't love you back. I mean, in the United States, we have a system where layoffs are just common. And this is the other thing. There were so many things that I learned in the course of reporting this book. There's so many things that we think, well, this is just the way things are. It's the way things have to be. It's the status quo. It's how we are, this, vibrant, rich economy. And this is the best way to be. And, you see it now with like the Jamie Dimons and the return to office. And this is how we have to work. And so I bought all of that. I worked like that, sort of the ideal worker. Norm is what the sociologists will call it. The person who comes in early, who stays late, who shows dedication, who puts their lives and their families second, to your work. So that's part of, I think a couple of things that were really shocking to me is, so you think, okay, so you'll make those sacrifices, you'll put work first, well, so then your work will be better. And I think that was shocking, is to see the research that's not true. That longer work hours actually lead to lower productivity. That the longer you work and sort of like you appear to be the ideal worker, you get so tired that it takes you longer to do stuff. You get kind of burned out. So you never get away. So you don't get fresh ideas. You don't really innovate. You don't come up with those kind of like cool new thoughts. You're just kind of grinding it out. And I thought that was really interesting. That was sort of like, that's taken me a long time to wrap my head around, because we think, we think if you work really hard, you're a better person. And that was so interesting to find that that's actually hardwired into us. That's sort of an evolutionary trait, that there are these researchers that have done fascinating research that they call the moralization of effort, that we as humans tend to value people who try and put in a lot of effort, even if there's no output, even if it doesn't pay off. They did this really interesting study that, they took a scenario of two people, and they both were automated out of a job, and they had a year to find another job. And one guy never came into the office, and the other guy came in every day, even though he had nothing to do. And they asked, who's the better person? And they said the guy who came into the office every day and sat around and didn't do anything, but he gave the appearance of effort. And so I think that was something that was really revelatory, that we're valuing the wrong things. So that when you value that effort and you value the long hours and you value what people would call input, are you sitting at a desk in front of a chair, can I see you in an office? And if that's what we value, that is a recipe for burnout. That's a recipe for sort of status quo. That's a recipe for the grind, and it doesn't even benefit employers, because then you've got all of these people, and then employers are thinking like, I got to make my books look good for Wall Street, but for the fourth quarter. So I'm going to lay off a bunch of people because labor is such a big cost, and so then you got these people like, oh my God, it might be me next. So I'm going to put in even longer hours. So you're kind of like, again, gifting your entire life to an employer who's not going to be loyal to you. And it doesn't result in better work and not even better performance or profits for the employer. So the employer shouldn't want that either. And yet we're stuck because we have this belief that that's the best way to work. And I think that was probably one of the biggest revelations, is that we don't have to do anything that we're doing. There's a myriad ways that we could work, and we could work better. And the reason we're stuck is because we have leaders who believe this is the best way to work. And it's not based on evidence or data. It's like mythology. That was really striking to me, because you want to think, well, Jamie Dimon, he's really smart. He's really rich. He must know. He doesn't know. And that's fascinating to me, that we are the power of what we believe. And so that's why the big message of the book is, we need to begin, first of all, to think about work in a much bigger way, that it is not just what we do for pay, but we need to start making room for all of the work we do outside of work. And I'm thinking of the unpaid work that mainly women are still primarily responsible for, caring, raising the next generation, caring for the previous generation, making a home, all of that unpaid work. That's, lots and lots of hours. And there's been research done that if you even paid the minimum wage, it would just add, trillions to GDP. That's a lot of effort that's totally invisible, that we expect people to somehow squeeze into an already really full life. So, we need to think about work bigger. And that's the first point. And the second point is all of that work should be fair. We human beings were wired for fairness, just like we're wired to value effort. We're wired to value fairness. We have a deep innate sense of what's fair. And, so that means at work, at paid work, you should be, your honest efforts, you should receive a just reward for that. And I write a lot about how that's really changed, especially in the last 40 or 50 years. That's no longer the case, which is why you see so much unhappiness and anxiety and unrest. But that does not have to be the case. We haven't raised the minimum wage since 2009, $7.29, or 25 cents or whatever it is. These are choices that we've made. We don't have to have a system where a CEO will earn 500 or 600 times more than the average worker. It used to be 30. There's always going to be some inequality. It's not like it's not like I'm arguing for like absolute equality. That didn't work. We saw that in the Eastern Bloc, that didn't work. But how can you have a fair system, so that whatever your efforts are, you're actually rewarded for that, and the same is true for the unpaid work. We need to be able to see it and value it and share it fairly, and not just assume that because you've got ovaries, you're the one that's going to do the dishes, and that you should do the laundry because you're somehow biologically wired to do it. It's like, it's a home you're creating. It's caring that you all share. That's something that should be a shared responsibility. So so that's sort of the second point of the book. All of that work should be fair. And then the third point is that it's entirely possible. And in every single chapter, I end with what I call a bright spot or a change agent of somebody who is not just doing lunchtime yoga or saying, giving you, like a gift certificate, to go have lunch if you worked a long day, but really changing the way we organize work. And I think the other real surprise, as a recovering workaholic or somebody with workaholic tendencies, I confess to it. There's a whole chapter on workaholism, and I kind of discovered I went to report about workaholics, and then in the middle of the interview, people were sort of like looking at me. It's like, you kind of sound like you belong here with us. And it's really funny because I just had coffee with somebody who's sort of become my unofficial mentor just last week. It was wonderful. So it's become a real community that has been very important to me. Um, but I didn't believe that it could be different. I didn't believe, I thought that if you worked shorter hours, you didn't do as good, your work wasn't as good. And I have really high standards, and I want excellence, right? And so that requires nose to the grindstone and long hours and blood, sweat, and tears and all of that. And that was a real revelation to me. And it's something I still struggle with. But in instance after instance after instance, I went to Iceland, where they've made short work hours available to over 80% of the workforce. And I'm like, how did you do that? And I didn't go to Iceland, like Americans, we love to say we're unique, and we're huge and we're diverse. And you can't go to these Scandinavian countries and say we should be like Denmark or Iceland. And that's not why I went there. I went there because they did this massive experiment on short work hours. And I wanted to understand how did you do that? And I will say that what I learned from the short work hours movements, and they did it not just for tech bros and sort of boutique firms. I went to childcare centers. I went to police stations. They made it. I talked to pool attendants, shift workers, as well as people who worked in factories, as well as people who were knowledge workers and travel agents and things like that. And what I found that was really interesting is the same thing that I found during the pandemic with the companies or the firms or the organizations that really managed moving from kind of in-person work, that 2019 style, to really embracing a very different style of work that was more flexible. That it didn't really matter where you worked because, during the pandemic when people were quarantining, you had to figure out how to work in different places, and how creative they were in coming up with working differently. And I will tell you, and I write about it in the appendix, sort of like, okay, this is what we can do, that they both shared the same elements. It was the same process that they went through. And it's a process that anybody can go through, either personally or also as a team or an organization. There's a recipe you can follow to change work. And it's not that hard to do, And the first thing that you got to do is switch your mindset, that belief. Maybe that's the hardest thing, is the journey between your own ears. But switch the belief that the input is what matters, the long hours, the sitting there, the showing your dedication. And what really matters is the output, the performance, the impact. What is it that you're doing out in the world? And if you change the focus on the impact, then what you end up doing is then you go back through your days and you go back through how you've organized work. Well, is everything that you're doing leading to that most important outcome? And if it's not, then you ask, well, why are we doing it? And a lot of times, well, first of all, it was amazing how many people don't ask that question. Why do we do it this way? And the second, it's amazing how many people will say, well, we've always done it this way. Well, that doesn't mean you should keep doing it that way. Just because you did it in the 19th century doesn't mean you should do it in the 21st. And work has become increasingly complex, and we've layered on more and more systems. We went from phone and voicemail to Slack to email to, instant messenger to Asana to Trello to this. And work itself has become so complicated that I found that I began to think of work in sort of three ways. There's that, the sort of the core center is that really important work, that outcome that you're going for. And, in the really great work redesigns or the short work hours movements, they made sure that all their processes ended up so that you would spend most of your time doing that. But what ends up happening is I ended up calling the second band the work around the work. And that's the emails and the meetings and the logistics planning and the back and forth with the ping ponging and the scheduling, and I've had people, working with me, and I was shocked at how much time they spent laying out their work schedule and then not doing their work. But they felt like at the end of the day that they'd put in a lot of time, that they felt like they'd worked. I'm like, well, where's the case study? Well, I didn't get to it because I've been laying out this whole, my whole work plan. So we get caught in that sort of merry-go-round of work around the work. And then we feel, like, we feel virtuous because it is work. And I remember one of the things I write about in the book is this project I was working on with Ideas 42, a behavioral science firm. And we were trying to understand what drives overwork in firms and spending a lot of time and asking people. And it was fascinating because they all would say, it's like, well, oh man, I was so busy all day long, and I got to the end of the day and I hadn't gotten to that one really important thing. And so I ended up staying late to do it, or I took work home, or I worked over the weekend to get it done. And then they were tired and resentful, and they didn't have time for their families, much less fun, and they came to work Monday, just kind of, it's a grind. And then then we asked, well, what were you doing all day that kept you so busy? It was going to meetings or plowing through their inbox and email, and it feels good. It feels like you're working. But if you have inbox zero, then you've just made everybody else's priorities yours, and you've just been responding and putting out fires. And you're not spending your time doing that work that's, the performance that is probably not only better for your employer and for the profit and whatever they're going for, but also for you and your sense of, I'm doing something important and meaningful in my life. So we've got that we get stuck in the merry-go-round of the work around the work. And then there was this final kind of third concentric circle that I began calling the performance of work. And other people have called it different things. But when you're in a culture, I'm looking at you, Jamie Dimon, I'm looking at you, Elon Musk, that says, I know who the best workers are because they're here all the time. If you're in a culture that values the ideal worker, that values that input, that values the person who looks like they're working, who looks busy, then you will create work so that you will also look busy. That might not have anything to do with that core priority, that core performance. But, you're doing the work around the work, spinning, and then you're doing the performance of work. And when, I went to Japan, sort of the classic grandfather of overworked places, where they have a word called karoshi, called dying from overwork, to really understand, well, what are they doing differently there? Because here in the West, we sort of dismiss them. It's like, oh, it's their samurai culture, and that's why they're doing it. And I found that that's not the case at all. They're very much driven to overwork in the same way that we are here. It's about culture. It's about belief. And one of the things that struck me the most is I was talking to this one young man, and he was still at his office at 11 o'clock at night. And I said, well, what are you doing? What could possibly be keeping you there at work at 11 o'clock at night? And he said, well, there's really nothing for me to do. And so I'm just standing at the copy machine making blank copies. And I said, well, why? And he said, because my boss hasn't left yet and I can't go until he goes. And that's the performance of work. And I ended up calling that. So there are some Japanese scholars who call that wasted time, wasted work. Dave Graver would have called it bullshit work, bullshit jobs. And I just called it stupid work. So I think that was the other thing that really shocked me is there's so much pain. There's so much illness and, chronic disease that comes from our overwork culture. We have a loneliness epidemic. People are worried about mental health. People are feeling isolated and alone and busy and worried that they're going to get laid off and stuck at work and working longer and longer and feeling like it's not paying off. And so much of it doesn't have to be this way. It's based on belief. It's based on unfair systems that we've created. It's based on unfair policies that we've passed that, because of stories that we've told that trickle down economics, and that if you make the wealthy wealthier, somehow it's better for all of us, which is such a crock of junk, and the data even shows that hasn't done anything for economic productivity. All it's done is transferred $50 trillion of wealth from the bottom to the top 10%, So So I think that was probably the biggest shock to me, is the power of the stories we tell ourselves and what we choose to believe. And it doesn't have to be this way.